let's talk about ammo registration. So now we got ammo registration. This isn't the capacity issue. This is all ammo. Passed into law in July and cemented by Prop 63. John Phillips, how is this going to affect gun owners, and what does it mean for ammo sales?
Well, I think I alluded to a lot of this earlier, but prices are going to go up. It's going to cut down on competition in the marketplace. It's going to, and again, the logic is out the door, but we're going to have to report every round that you purchase through us. You can't give ammunition to your friend. Everything is going to be reportable. You're going to have to pay a fee to have an ammunition purchase license. I believe it's every 2 years it gets renewed under Prop 63. How they're going to do that renewal, I don't know if there's going to be additional fees as yet to be determined. The craziness of this is, so as many of us who do a lot of training know, it's very easy for us to shoot a lot of rounds in a day. One day of class, we have classes that shoot 800 to 1,000 rounds in a day. So if you get reported for buying 10,000 rounds of ammo and you've done that 3, 4, 5 times a year, all they're going to see is that you own 30, 40, 50,000 rounds of ammo. Well, who's keeping tabs of the ammo that you've expended? No one. So I don't understand where this is going or what the goal here is. All I know is everything is going to be reportable. We're going to have to get thumbprints. We're going to have to check you to make sure that you're on this approved list. And how that list is actually being put together is a combination of handgun purchases up through a certain date, your criminal record, and then you having that card. So it's administrative, and as we all know, it's just a lot more cumbersome to us because then they come in and they do audits on us. So now not only are we responsible for every firearm, for every high-capacity magazine, and now literally every round of ammunition that comes to the facility. So there will be a cost, and I think that ammunition in California, there's a lot of manufacturers that are going to be a little bit nervous as to making sure that the ammo gets to proper ammunition vendors, and it might slow down the supply a little bit. So I anticipate at the end of the year, there will probably be a run on ammo. I would anticipate that.
Other comments on the ammo issue?
I think that one of the important things, when we pass laws, they're supposed to have a purpose, they're supposed to solve a problem, rather than kind of jam somebody's opinion, rather than take advantage of a horrible situation like a crime or something like that, and jamming your unreasonable bias through based on that. And really what I'm talking about is, as a country, if you look at how many deaths there are where there is a gun involved, well, about half of them are suicides. And registering ammunition is not going to stop somebody from committing suicide. And if you look at the rest of them, it's pretty clear statistically that these are people that are repeat offenders or people that are mentally unstable. And out of those two groups, the repeat offenders are committing a ton of crime, not just crimes with guns, but a ton of crime, which is why they're repeat offenders, right? It's kind of obvious. So how is ammunition registration tackling any of those three groups? Well, it's not. It's not doing any of that. So really what they're doing is leveraging these statistics, and they're not solving problems because, again, I say it over and over again, criminalizing normal behavior is never going to drop crime statistics. It's just not going to happen. So if repeat offenders are causing crime and they're not being prosecuted, and that's why they continue to be the cause of crime, and you have people that are mentally unstable and they continue to do horrible criminal acts, making you and I register to buy ammunition, by the way, the same steps you had to go through to buy the gun, it's not going to stop repeat offenders and the mentally unstable. And if you ask people, well, gee, why would they buy ammunition and go, if you stop somebody from buying ammunition through going through this criminal background check and that sort of thing, why would they be buying if they were stopped by this hoop that they have to jump through? Why would they be buying ammunition? They say, oh, well, for their gun. Well, what gun? I mean, how could they pass, and get a gun? How did they pass the background check in the first place? Well, then they don't have an answer. And the reality is that there is an irrational fear for what is normal behavior, and that's gun ownership. And a lot of these laws are just simply not solving the problem. And when you really break it down, it completely falls apart. It doesn't stand up to logic. It doesn't stand up to a sniff test. It really is people just leveraging a horrible situation like a crime statistic to advance, their agenda, their political, their irrational agenda.
I had one of the gun ban zealots on my show, and I was asking those very same questions, and she said, well, yes, it's true that a lot of these guns in crimes are actually stolen, not purchased, because there tends to be a certain flavor or variety of criminals, and they have priors. But that's why we need the ammo registration requirement, because they might have been able to steal that gun, but we're gonna trip them up on getting the ammo. And I said, don't you think people are gonna know that their gun is missing a little bit more than knowing that their ammo is perhaps a little short? And she didn't have an answer for that. But of course, this is not about ammo. This is about that overall goal of taking away the Second
Carl,
Amendment entirely. Yeah.
We're up here preaching to the choir. I mean, I think everybody in this room is, firmly on board with protecting our rights, and we all believe in that thing, that piece of paper that, a lot of us have fought and willing to die for. The problem is Prop 63 went through with over a 65% approval rate. And that is the power in this room that we have is we need to start demanding of our advocates, the NRA, the California gun owners, all the different groups that are out there represent us to fight in California.
And I want you to save that, because I want to really just iron out just the legalities first, because we're going to get into action taking, because you're absolutely right about that. Anything else on ammo registration, of the technicalities and compliance?
Yeah, again, this is a thing that's fairly unique to a competition shooter. It's like Michael mentioned, it's kind of a perspective thing. It's how each person's perspective is on normal behavior. I saw a news story out of Santee a couple years ago where a guy was being served a warrant for an unrelated crime, and when they went and served the warrant, they found that he had ammunition. The news reported that he had an arsenal of ammunition, and on the news they showed an officer carrying out a few bricks of 22. If you think a few bricks of 22 is an arsenal of ammunition, don't come to my house. When I travel for a match, I routinely travel with around 2,000 rounds of combined ammunition. And to some people that sounds like a lot, but to any competition shooter, that's really not that much. An average match, you'll expend about 1,200 rounds of ammunition over a 3-day match. But I've lived in Illinois for 4 years. I was stationed there where you had to have a FOID card, a firearms ownership identification card, and to purchase ammo, you just had to show your FOID card and you could buy ammo. California has taken it about a dozen steps beyond that. But just as a shooter and as a person that regularly possesses and purchases and expends a large amount of ammunition, my first thought on this law was, number one, somebody somewhere had a visit from the Good Idea Ferry and just passed a law because they thought they could. This one is one that's going to be really difficult. All you have to be is a little bit creative, and in my interpretation, you're not even doing anything illegal, but all you have to do is be a little bit creative, and you can think of a dozen ways to sidestep all this and really circumvent the law and stay legal. As John pointed out, ammunition is a consumable, there can't really be any enforcement or accountability on ammunition that you already possessed, or how can you account for expended ammunition? You come into reloading ammunition. When I say reloading, I don't mean slapping in a fresh magazine. Taking a spent case and putting powder and primer and a projectile back on it and doing that in your basement. There's also no provision in the law for that. A lot of people think that's going to be the next thing they go after is reloading components, but right now there's no accountability for that either. As a shooter, this is one I'm not too worried about. This is one that's going to be a lot more difficult to deal with for the retailers and range owners. As a shooter, like I said, you only need to be a little bit creative, and it'll be a little bit inconvenient because you can't just walk into Walmart anymore. But to me, this isn't a big deal to me. I can get right around it.
Let's talk about the roster for handguns certified for sale. It's a requirement for all manufacturers to pay to get their product tested, and now the recent new pistols are now required to stamp a serial number on the casing, or they will not be added to the list. John Phillips, how's that going to impact things like costs and ownership?
Well, the microstamping is like trying to find a unicorn in the room. It doesn't exist. So, we've seen the roster go from, 3,000 guns down to less than 600?
It doesn't count for different colors.
Yeah, and roster, even if it's a different color gun, is no longer, allowed. So one gun is approved in black. If we try to sell it in pink, it's illegal. It's competition. If only certain guns are allowed in California, there's no opportunity for the consumer to have a voice and be willing to, and to go out and fight, the pricing. More importantly, and I think Jamie alluded to this earlier, is what's really happening with this microstamping in the roster is we have firearms now that are coming out that are safer than the firearms that are on the roster. So if somebody makes an improvement to a gun that's currently on the roster and they change and put a safer spring or a safer connecting rod in it because they found a failure, that gun would be illegal because they can't go back through the recertification process, because any firearm that goes through the recertification process has to now be able to be microstamped. And the technology doesn't exist. There's a lot of people out there, it just doesn't exist. So we are, in California, are having to buy firearms that are technically inferior to what people in other states are. And I'm a little disappointed that argument hasn't been made in the courts. It would have been probably one of the better arguments than the way they went at it the last time. But yeah, competition's not there. We have very limited accessibility to better firearms. And we're going to see costs continue to go up because manufacturing processes of the older firearms are not near as efficient as how they're manufacturing the newer firearms. And so there's a cost. And we're seeing it in a number of different areas.
Others on the list?
Yeah, so John described it very well, but a good example when he's talking about older models. So we, in California, can only own the Glock Generation 3 version. That is a 19-year-old model. They've had that around for that long, and we've already entered into Generation 4, and soon I'm hearing rumors of Generation 5s coming out. So we're forced to shoot a 19-year-old model gun as opposed to any of these newer models that may have safer stuff. Unfortunately, this microstamping law, it's served to the California public under the guise of a safety regulation, but in fact, it is at most, and I believe this is actually a failed argument, but at most it is a law enforcement measure because all microstamping does is allow the tracing of, theoretically, it allows the tracing of a firearm bullet back to the person who shot it and the gun they shot it with. There are 1,000 different ways that this doesn't work as a law enforcement theory, and you switch out firing pin, you can file down your serial number on the pin if you want to do that. Just wear and tear will erase these microstamps. So there's any number of issues with that, but an honest-to-God assessment of this is that it is a long-term ban on semi-automatic pistols in California. Because no new gun can be entered onto the roster, eventually, as we keep seeing every year, more and more companies will drop their guns because they have to reapply every couple of years, resubmit firearms for testing, resubmit money. So eventually this will lead to an all-out ban on semi-automatic pistols. In the previous lawsuits that have been filed, that's one of the state's defenses is that, well, this isn't a significant burden on the Second Amendment because we still allow revolvers to be added to the list without microstamping. They do not need microstamping under law. So that's their argument. Unfortunately, when the time comes, which it will at this rate, where you cannot buy a semi-automatic pistol in California from an FFL dealer like John here, that is a ban on semi-automatic pistols in California, and that's going to eventually strengthen our argument against it. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wait for that to happen if the courts don't start listening to our arguments and the fact that these are ill-conceived, bad laws that have nothing to do with safety whatsoever.
Well, and if this microstamping ever did come to fruition, it'll give a whole different definition of policing your own brass. Because you wouldn't want your brass picked up by anybody else but you. So we're all going to be on the range looking to make sure our serial numbers match because we don't want our brass to be used, taken, it's like fingerprints. So it's a mess, and the technology doesn't exist. It's not going to happen anytime soon. So
And
we're stuck.
frankly, there's serious Fourth Amendment issues when it comes to, I went to a range, I shot my gun with micro-stamping, and a criminal came into that range later on, picked up a bunch of spent shell casings that have 50 people's different serial numbers on the gun, then goes, commits a crime, and throws those on the ground. You now have implicated 50 different people in a crime. And you're going to have to deal with those issues of dealing with law enforcement throughout the investigations. This also has an effect, Fourth Amendment stuff, with ammunition registration. If something happens, a phone call gets called, or a domestic violence issue, or any issue where police are called because your neighbor doesn't like you or doesn't like the fence you put up, and they happen to look on the system and see that over the course of 10 years you've bought 1 million rounds of ammunition, that may give them enough evidence to consider you a danger to your neighbor, and then you're going to go deal with people knocking on your door and dealing with all the Fourth Amendment and Fifth Amendment issues on that. So there is a significant danger in this when it comes to the law.
Other compliance issues, because I'm going to we're going to shift into politics, but other compliance issues, anything else that we didn't cover that you really want people to know they need to comply with to stay on the right side of the law? All right, and I know that some of you may have questions, specific questions, and we're going to deal with compliance issues again.
Without someone doing something about it, it's not going to get any better.